go ahead and get started. I think we're making the last call out in the cafeteria area. So please come in and get a seat and we'll get started. So my name is Dave Nielsen, and I'm the co-founder of CloudCamp. And we're doing something different that we haven't done before, which is an event where it's sort of a lessons learned from CloudCamp, and then we're applying that to the OpenStack community. And so I want to welcome you today, and I also want to thank you for welcoming us to the HP auditorium here. So thank you very much. As you can see, we have our primary sponsor is HP, and we've been to a few different cities over the last 2.5 weeks. We started off in Hong Kong, and then we went to Singapore, then Kuala Lumpur, and Jakarta. And then I took a slight detour and went to Goa. Got a little bit of sun, and then arrived yesterday to have CloudCamp for OpenStack in Bangalore. So it's been a wonderful journey. I've got some folks who've been coming along with us. A few of them are here with us right now. Let's see, where is Sunil's right here? Raise your hand, Sunil. And Vikram, did Vikram come in, or is he still outside? Okay, Vikram is outside, and I think Larry Carvalho is outside as well. So they've been on the sort of the road trip with us. And Sunil and Vikram are from HP, and Larry is with his own analyst firm called Robust Cloud, but he will be joining IDC within this month. I also want to thank a few other folks who helped make this possible. In particular, my longtime friend Prem Sankar, right here. Raise your hand, Prem. Prem has been involved with CloudCamp in Bangalore since the very beginning in 2009. And so we've been here quite a few times, and every time we can rely on Prem, sometimes to help out, other times just to do almost the whole thing yourself. So this time you get to relax a little bit. So let's see. So what we have in store for you today is hopefully some useful lessons learned and ideas for you, as well as some demonstrations of how you can use the cloud either by building a new application or deploying an existing application. And so that's what our primary theme will be today, is what are the different ways in which you can deploy an application on the cloud. And we'll have a presentation by me, which is more or less lessons learned about how to deploy and some thoughts on deploying applications. Then we'll have a panel with Larry Carvalho leading the Q&A with some panelists. And by the way, if any of you would like to join the panel, you will be given the opportunity. So if you would like to, please raise your hand at the appropriate time and you can come up and join the panel. Let's see, we'll also have a presentation about how to deploy applications using enterprise solutions. And then I think about that time, if I'm not missing anything, we'll wrap up the first part of our event and we'll move on to the second part of our event, which will be demonstrations of how to stack up applications up on top of OpenStack, or really any type of integration you want to do with OpenStack. The goal of our event is not only to share with you some things that we've learned, and also hear from some of the participants, but also to start highlighting some of the solutions that folks are building that runs on top of OpenStack. Because as you know, OpenStack is not only used to run public cloud, but it also can be used to run a private cloud, and that's quite an achievement, quite frankly. So OpenStack is now becoming something that organizations are starting to use, and I think we want to highlight different types of solutions and applications that are actually being deployed on OpenStack. One more thing I'd like to share is that CloudCamp has been an organization that over the past 5 years has primarily talked about what is cloud computing, In the beginning, it was more around what are the types of opportunities, and we also talked about different parts of cloud computing. So sometimes we talked about scaling out your application like a startup would, or we talked about big data, because a lot of big data gets generated in the cloud. Or we talked about DevOps, because sometimes deploying your application in the cloud requires new thinking and new ways, new technologies and skills. And so we've had these different themes that we've talked about. And this has really been the first time that we've talked about a specific product, which is an open source project, and there's a lot of folks who are using it as the foundation for their own product. So it's not one company's product, but it is nonetheless a product. And so what we've decided to do is, rather than have this event in the future be part of Cloud Camp, which is supposed to be generally a discussion about cloud computing in general, we're going to start a new event, which right now we're calling Stackup. And the idea is to have the same type of conversation we've had around Cloud Camp and cloud computing, but do it specifically for the OpenStack community, which is really what we're doing and demonstrating here today. So in order to honor OpenStack, I've been creating an application called campsite.org. And so what we're going to do is use campsite.org, which is running on top of OpenStack, to create groups that can organize their own events in Bangalore or around the world. And this way we can encourage people to get together and demonstrate the things that they've created on top of OpenStack. So I just wanted to introduce that to you and share with you the idea behind this event and the idea behind Stackups going forward. Okay, so I think we've given you an overview of what we're going to talk about today. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody have any questions? Okay, no questions, all right. So the last thing I wanted to do is actually okay. So what I also wanted to do is just quickly go through and share with you the actual agenda so you can see it. So if you have internet access, maybe most of you don't, but if you do, this is essentially what you'll find if you go back to the website. Okay, and so I'm going to start by giving an overview of some different ways you can use open source to deploy applications. We're going to then have Mohit Sethi give a demonstration of Vagrant. How many of you have heard of Vagrant? Only a few of you? Okay, I think you'll find this very interesting. Then we're going to have we call it an unpanel. We do have some people who we've asked to be on the panel, but we would like to also encourage others of you. So if any of you have experience that will help others understand the challenges and possibly the opportunities to deploying applications on OpenStack, maybe you would like to volunteer to be on that panel. Then we'll have a session on enabling hybrid cloud for the enterprise. Using CSA 4.0 with Manish Adesai of HP. And then we'll have a breaking session, a break, followed by our demonstrations. And so you can see our demonstrations are here. And a couple of folks I didn't quite get checked in, or at least didn't see them. Maybe they're not here yet because their session isn't until later. But I was just wondering, is Shurushki and are they here?
Yeah.
Okay, you guys are here. All right, wasn't sure. And then how about also Ramakrishnan and Arusha? Let's see. Anusha, are they here yet? Okay, hopefully they'll come later. And am I missing anybody? Who is somebody? I think demo number 4. I didn't actually write down who the name was. Okay, and which one is that?
We're going to talk about hybrid cloud using Horizon, cloud enablers.
Yeah, and then which company are you with?
Cloud enablers.
Cloud enablers. That's right. Okay. So that's your spot right there. Thank you for catching that. So we got everybody but Ramakrishnan and Anusha, but I think they'll probably come by 5:30. All right, great. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move forward to our first session, which is actually my session. But again, before we go any further, I want to encourage you to ask questions or make some comments. So just to make sure that everyone here feels comfortable that they can raise their hand and ask a question, let's just check to see. All right? So I'd like everyone who has a right arm, please raise your right arm. Okay, that looks almost unanimous. Okay. All right. So, okay, I know you can do that. Let's test that out a little bit further. How many of you consider yourself to be some sort of developer or sysadmin or other type of technical person? And that's your job is mostly technical. Raise your hand. Almost everybody. Okay. All right. That's a lot of people. All right. Well, very good. I think that'll give us sort of a baseline. How about this? How many of you are specifically working on a cloud-related project today? Raise your hand. Okay, it's not everybody, but probably about 3/4 or 2/3 of you. Okay, very good. And one last thing is, how many of you have actually committed code to the OpenStack project? Oh, a few people. All right, very cool. That's at least 3 or 4 hands there. All right. Well, thank you for being here.
So what was the mix of developers that you saw?
We didn't really divide that. So how many of you would consider yourself, if we were to say either developer, sysadmin, or other? Okay, you can only raise your hand once. Now, how many consider yourself to be other? Okay, so that's about 15. How many consider yourself to be like a sysadmin type? It's another 15 or so. How many developer type? Okay, that's about half the crowd. All right, very good. There you go, mostly developers. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. But if anybody does have any questions in my talk, I'm more than happy to take questions during the talk. So feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Okay, so what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about deploying application stacks in the cloud. And I'll get to the punchline in just a moment, so let me just go ahead and continue on here. First of all, a little bit about me, so you understand where I'm coming from, is I was a self-taught Visual Basic developer in the 90s, and I actually started to teach programming and did consulting. And as I was doing that, I discovered there's this thing called the internet. And it was kind of a new idea, at least the World Wide Web was sort of a newer idea. And the Mosaic browser had become something that people were starting to talk about. And then Netscape Navigator had launched. And so now there was websites like Yahoo that popped up. And it was an exciting time. However, since I was a Microsoft developer, Microsoft didn't have a lot of technologies for the web back then. And so it was hounding them, hounding them, hounding them. And finally they came out with something that was called the DB Web they bought. It was eventually called the Internet Database Connector, and then eventually it was called Denali, and then eventually it was called Active Server Pages. We now refer to it as Classic Active Server Pages, or Classic ASP. So I was very early into the web, and I've watched a lot of it evolve over time. And in 1999, I got involved with web APIs. And in 2001, when Microsoft and IBM announced SOAP, I was very early, started a user group in 2001 where we started talking about the business models and the technologies related to web APIs. This sort of caught PayPal's attention, and they hired me to become their first web API evangelist. And I don't know how many of you were around back then, but it wasn't very often that you developers would build websites that actually relied on other websites. That was kind of unusual back then. Payments were maybe one of the only exceptions. So I was evangelizing web APIs. And I eventually left to go to a company called StrikeIron, which was a web API marketplace, which back in 2006 was a little too early. So it didn't go great. Eventually I left and became an independent consultant, and I was very early to the Amazon Web Services platform. I was a beta developer there, also on the Salesforce.com platform. And right after that, we decided to start CloudCamp. And CloudCamp was really meant to be a discussion around what is cloud computing. And this was an interesting question back then. It's not as interesting now, 5 years later. But it was interesting then because at the time we didn't know, is infrastructure as a service cloud computing is platform as a service cloud computing. How are they related to software as a service and web APIs? Are these things all in the same ballpark? Or are they really completely different concepts altogether? And quite frankly, is this thing called cloud computing a fad? We didn't know. And out of the first cloud camp that we had, there were about 350 people. 17 companies were started. So it was very early. So I've watched all this. 2 of those companies that were started, one is now called Cloud Foundry, another one is now called OpenStack. So we were very early to that. And I've watched this whole thing happen, and I've seen all these different technologies come out, like big data and DevOps and all that kind of stuff. So, and now I'm consulting for HP, where I'm a developer evangelist. And I'm telling you all this because what I want to do is share with you some of the ideas that have come out of the Cloud Camp. For many of you, this will be somewhat new, or there'll be some new ideas. I think maybe for some of you who have been involved for a very long time, maybe it's not so new, but we're going to show you some demos, so that'll be kind of cool. All right, so as I said, we've had this Cloud Camp tour. We were recently over in Hong Kong. And what I'd like to do at all of our events is very quickly share with you something that maybe you hadn't thought of before. Which, first of all, when we talk about cloud computing, what is cloud computing? Well, most of us think of cloud computing today as the term that became popularized starting in around 2006. Actually, the term itself wasn't popularized really more until about 2008. But it was referring to technologies that came out in about 2006. And that was infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Okay? But looking back, we finally realized that software as a service and web APIs are also types of cloud computing. So while the term cloud computing has really only been around since about 2008, the technology for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service has been around since about 2006. But web APIs and software as a service have actually been around since the 90s. So the concepts, the fundamental concepts behind cloud computing have been around for a while. And then it was in 2010 which OpenStack was announced. And that was, it wasn't the first open source cloud software, but it's become more or less the largest at this point, largest project at least. So the point to take away from this is that cloud computing is not just infrastructure as a service. It is not just platform as a service. It's really a concept that has a lot to do with automation. And this automation is really important because it creates a lot of, it destroys a lot of manual labor, and it creates a lot of potential value. And so because of that, it's essentially unstoppable. And so the question isn't really about if cloud computing, it's more about when cloud computing and where. Will cloud computing be public cloud, or will it be private cloud? Will it be soon, or will it be later? And I think that the quote that I like the best, which was popularized, I think, by Tim O'Reilly, but I think somebody else came up with it, which is, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. So cloud computing is definitely here, and it's coming along in different ways and areas. So what makes cloud computing unstoppable? Well, these are the characteristics that we have defined as a part of Cloud Camp as being the most important characteristics of cloud computing. The first is that it's on demand. And what that means is, if you want to use somebody's cloud, even a private cloud, you shouldn't have to call somebody and say, hey, will you go plug something in for me, or will you go set something up? It should already be set up and ready for you to sign up for an account. All right? That can either be a private cloud, where the company has set up their own internal cloud, and you as a developer who need to do a dev and test, you need a virtual machine for dev and test, you shouldn't have to tell somebody to go and set up a VM for you. You should have a way to access that on demand. Okay? Now, once it's on demand and you've created an account and you're ready, then of course you should be able to use the service. And I think that's just self-explanatory. It's self-service. But there's a big difference between the two. Because there's many companies who say, oh yeah, we offer cloud computing. but you gotta call them, they're gonna go and set up some servers for you. That's not cloud computing, that's regular computing. And there's really nothing wrong with regular computing, it's just not cloud computing. So let's not confuse the two, okay? Also, I think the most famous characteristic for cloud computing is that it's scalable. So if you create a startup and you only have 1 or 2 servers, and all of a sudden you get a bunch of publicity and you need more servers, very quickly you can add more servers and take advantage of that publicity. Whereas in the past, it would be very difficult to add more servers. In fact, your servers might get overwhelmed, nobody can access your website, and instead of wild success, you have a miserable failure. So cloud computing enables you to start small and grow quickly with your success. And finally, because somebody else is offering this service on your behalf, then you need some information to tell you if the service is indeed running. So it needs to be measurable, and it can be simply on or off. Is my server running? That could be enough. But you need something to tell you that the service that somebody else is providing is actually doing what you asked. So this is all based on discussions that we've had at Cloud Camp. And the way you should ask, if you're ever asking yourself, why is cloud computing important? Just simply ask yourself, what is different about cloud computing than regular computing? Ask yourself that question, and you'll probably eventually end up with these 4 characteristics or something similar. And this applies to software as a service, web APIs, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service. And of course, when you get into each one of those, the details become more specific, such as with infrastructure as a service, APIs are very important. Also, if you put an API in front of each one of these concepts, then not only can you remove your vendor from being a hurdle, you can remove yourself from being a hurdle. Because a business process that all of a sudden needs a cloud service can automatically go and create an account, start using the service, scale it up and use it, get some information back to tell you did it work, and then maybe even turn the service off and continue going on, all without a human being having to be involved. So that's where you can see the cloud going. And with all of this, you can characterize it as being on-demand, self-service, scalable, or measurable, or the acronym OSSM, which sounds like awesome. So cloud computing is awesome. Now, how do we actually use cloud computing? A lot of you raised your hands and said you're developers. Now, are you really developing in the cloud? I've run a lot of hackathons. We had a hackathon that was sponsored by HP and Intel. And it was a 2-day hackathon where we brought together folks who wanted to, who worked for like a nonprofit or had an idea that was for social good. And they stood up in front of the developer audience and said, here's my idea, I'd like somebody to help me build this. And then the developers in the audience could say, hey, that's great, I like your project, I'm going to help you this weekend build that. So they had 24 hours, and because of that, you'd think they'd, oh, we use cloud computing because that's going to help me develop my application faster. But the truth of the matter is, cloud computing doesn't really help you write your code faster. You still write your code on your laptop, right? You don't type like this, right? You're writing a code on your laptop. So it's not really changing the way you write your code. The programming language could be the same. There might be some differences, but by and large, the greatest value of cloud computing is that you can deploy quickly. So at the end of the weekend or during the weekend, when that team writes their code on their laptop and now they want to share it, they can on demand get a server and deploy their code quickly. So cloud computing provides more of a benefit about deploying quickly. Of course, deploying quickly helps you develop more quickly because you can then get somebody to take a look at your application and give you feedback, and then you can iterate much more quickly and improve faster, and therefore code a better application faster. So, deploying faster is important. It gives you increased utilization, but more importantly, I think, is it gives you agility. And so, while a lot of companies think about cloud computing as a way to save money, I think more of the early adopters are thinking about how can I use cloud computing to move faster. I don't really care if it saves me money. So there's both of those. And what is deployment? Well, deployment usually means that you need to orchestrate which virtual machine or which service you need, and then deploy them in the correct order. And then you need to configure those services once they've been deployed, and then you need to manage them. So the question comes down to, what do we actually deploy? Okay, what kind of applications are we deploying? And are those applications just code, or are they dependent on a complete stack? And in most cases, you're actually deploying a lot of technologies together, not just your PHP code. There's perhaps some other services involved. For example, if you've got the traditional LAMP stack that we've known about for so long, you've got PHP, you've got MySQL. Of course, it's running on a Linux server, and you're using Apache. Okay, that's kind of like one stack that you might need to deploy. And of course, your LAMP stack doesn't just depend on PHP. It might be Python, it might be Perl. So there's a couple different stacks just within LAMP. And then if you're a Java developer, there's a lot of different enterprise technologies out there. So you might have a simple stack like this, but there's all sorts of maybe identity management, a lot of different technologies that you may need to deploy in order for your application to run. And then along comes Ruby and Ruby on Rails. And now you get your startups who are getting a little more creative. Sure, they got the Ruby on Rails framework, and that helps them build things a certain way, but maybe they're not using NoSQL or MySQL. Maybe they're using some other SQL, or maybe they're using NoSQL. Or maybe because Ruby on Rails isn't all that fast, they're using memcached or some other caching technology to help their application run a little faster. And then on the front end, they might be using some JavaScript or some other technology. So the stack is much more than just the server, the language, and the database. It's becoming more and more complicated. And this isn't stopping. It just continues. It seems like the trend is more complexity, not less. So now we've got this concept of a full stack developer, somebody who can do both the back end, the front end, maybe some graphics and some UI, the whole thing. Sort of like a startup in one person. And they need to know additional technologies, because not only are they developing maybe just some JavaScript on the front end, they might also be developing a mobile app. And their mobile app and their JavaScript front end might need to talk to a back end that's common. Maybe they're using Node.js, something like that. So there's just a whole bunch of technologies now. It continues to get more and more complicated. So it's important that when you are building an application, that you choose the right stack for your app. And there's a lot of different ways to explain this or categorize it. I like to say that you've got your existing applications that maybe you didn't even create. Boxed application, packaged application, whatever you want to call it. And you need to deploy that type of application. It might not even really be an application. It might just be virtual desktop. There's all sorts of different things you want to deploy in the cloud. So there's the kind of packaged stuff. Then you've got your custom enterprise web or mobile application that you create specifically for your company's needs. And the enterprise applications tend to look very different than a consumer web application. Okay, different set of technologies, different services, different integrations. And then of course now you got your native mobile apps or your iPads or your tablets. So they all have their own different stack. How many of you have heard of backend as a service? Okay, backend as a service, only a few of you, okay. So the concept behind backend as a service is if you're building a native mobile application, most of the code is actually running on the phone. So you don't need platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. So what does the cloud look like if your code is running on your phone? Well, you might need to save, if it's a game, like the user ID and password and their score. Okay? And so all you need is a database in the cloud. You don't even need the actual programming language in the cloud. Just an API call. So again, these stacks look very different. not only are there different types of stacks and different types of applications, but there's also different types of clouds. So if you're working on OpenStack, then you know very much about infrastructure as a service. But think about this. One of the main use cases for OpenStack is just simply to take all of your existing enterprise applications and move them over onto OpenStack. If you're going to do that, most of those existing applications aren't even using cloud services. They're just running on regular compute, and maybe block storage, and they use a network. That looks pretty much like the exact same stuff we've been doing for the past 15 years. So you're just simply taking an existing application, and you're putting it out into a cloud that looks like our existing traditional network. And there's a lot of value there, because you can spin those services up and spin them down when you need them. If you only need them a couple times a day or a week or a month, great, there they are, there they're not. And you can use those resources for other services or other applications when you need them. So there's a lot of value there. Now, if you're using cloud to build a new application, or if you want to maybe build a hybrid application that you take a traditional application and you want part of it to scale better, maybe you replace your uploading of photos or videos or other files from traditional storage to object storage. And now you start seeing how infrastructure as a service plus means you're adding scalable platform services to your traditional cloud environment, or traditional IT environment, really, in the cloud. And so that's what infrastructure as a service plus means. It's start up with your basic infrastructure as a service, and then add things like storage as a service, or database as a service, or message queue as a service. And you can start off using all that same code you've always used and just change a few pieces of the code that need to scale to use those new services. This is very practical stuff. This is what enterprises are looking to do. Start off with getting some value today, and then have a path forward that allows them to scale. Now, if you use infrastructure as a service plus, and you start adding lots of services, and you figure out how to automate that, at the end of the day, you're kind of building your own platform as a service. You're automating the deployment of your code that can scale. And that fundamentally is what platform as a service offers you. So, platform as a service is sort of a third type of cloud, where all of those, the infrastructure of the service and the additional platform services are all bundled up into one product or offering, and we call that platform as a service. Okay, so, sounds pretty good. We're getting somewhere. But what happens to that whole programming in the cloud thing? I mean, we kind of want that, right? Like, it'd be kind of nice someday if you just write your code, and every time you completed a new command, it just automatically was saved into the cloud, and you didn't have to worry about deploying anything. That'd be kind of nice, you know? Just put all of our stacks in the cloud. And in fact, there are some services that behave like this. I don't know if any of you have ever played around with Force.com, but I was a developer on Force.com back when it was called Apex. This is when it was in beta. And when Force.com first came out, you actually coded in your browser. In fact, you can still do that today with Visual Force, I think is what it's called. And so I wrote an article about how you could integrate with that using classic ASP, or actually ASP.NET. It's still the #1 article 6 years later. So if you do Force and ASP, my article will show up at the top. I wrote a good article. And I learned a lot about this because at the time there was this theory that you could just write your code in a browser and you wouldn't ever have to worry about writing code on your laptop. Turns out a lot of people don't really like to do that because maybe the network is disconnecting and you're losing your code, or it's slow. And you know how Wi-Fi can be sometimes if you're not connected. So for enterprise developers, they still, and most developers still like to write their code on their laptop. And of course, there's Heroku, which came up with an innovative model where they built like a platform as a service offering, but they actually ran it on another cloud. And they focused just simply on the deployment of Ruby on Rails applications, and they did a really good job. And in fact, Salesforce eventually bought them. And then there's Google App Engine. And these are all great products, they really are. The problem is that they only run on those clouds. And they're very proprietary. In other words, in most cases, you can't take that code and run it anywhere else. So you're pretty much stuck on that one cloud. All right? And this is a disadvantage in some ways, especially for enterprises. So, again, great products, but I would say mostly for consumer web applications and that kind of thing. Now, the enterprise still wants that benefit. They still want to be able to write code and have it deployed easily for them. And so there are these products that have come out. Like I said, Cloud Foundry was just an idea of a guy named Chris Richardson in 2008 at our first Cloud Camp. I've watched it evolve all these years. And the same with OpenShift, which back then, believe it or not, its name was OSS 1701, which is open source software with the homage to Starship Enterprise.